She looked at the tattoos that paid for her wedding dress and told me they clashed with the color scheme. Let that sink in for a second. Because I sat with it a lot longer than a second, I'll tell you that much. My name's Robert Callahan. I'm 58 years old. I've lived in Savannah my whole life. And up until about 5 months ago, I would have told you the worst thing that ever happened to me was already behind me. I would have been wrong. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one's going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Let me back up. Because you need to understand these arms before you understand what happened because of them. I got my first tattoo at 19, a week before I shipped out with the Navy, an anchor on my forearm that my own father called foolishness and I called the only thing that felt permanent about a life that wasn't. 20 years in, I kept adding to it. A ship's wheel for my first deployment. My late wife Diane's name in cursive script along my left bicep. Added the week we got married in a courthouse because neither of us could afford anything fancier. A compass rose on my right shoulder for the year our daughter Kayla was born. By the time I retired a chief petty officer at 40, both my arms and most of my chest told the story of my entire life in ink, and I have never once regretted a single piece of it. I came home to Savannah after retirement and built something nobody expected out of a man covered in tattoos who talked slow and drove an old truck. I opened a small marine salvage and restoration yard down on the river, buying up damaged boats nobody wanted, fixing them with these same hands, selling them for a fraction of what a dealership would charge and twice what I paid. Slow work. Honest work. By 2015, I had 4 employees and a waiting list. By 2020, a regional marina and yacht services company called Coastal Harbor Group bought the operation outright, kept me on as a consultant, and I walked away from that sale with more money than I ever expected to see in one lifetime. I didn't change how I lived. Not one bit. Still drove the same Ford F-150 with 210,000 miles on it. Still wore the same faded band t-shirts and work boots. Still got my hair cut at the same barbershop on Bull Street where they've known me since before Kayla was born. I put almost everything from that sale into a private trust, structured quietly, no public filings with my name attached in any searchable way, managed through a holding company with Diane's family name on the paperwork instead of mine. I did that on purpose. A man doesn't need his name on anything to know what he built. Diane passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone within 8 months. She's the one who set up that trust with me before she got sick, sat across the kitchen table and said, "Robert, whatever we build it quiet. Let people see you, not the number." I've kept that promise every day since, mostly because it's one of the last things she ever asked of me. My sister Carol, 2 years older than me, has lived 3 streets over since our mother passed the house down between us. Carol never got a single tattoo in her life, thinks I'm a little foolish for all of mine, tells me so every Sunday over dinner, and loves me anyway, which is its own kind of honesty I've always respected more than false politeness. Carol's the one who really knew Diane best, the one who sat with her in the hospital those last weeks when I couldn't make myself do anything but hold Diane's hand and listen to machines beep. Carol's the one who told me, after the funeral, that keeping that trust quiet was the last real gift I could give my wife, and I've believed her on that every day since. My old crew from the salvage yard still stops by some Fridays, for guys now scattered across 3 different marinas along the coast. Still call me chief out of habit even though I haven't worn a uniform in 18 years. None of them know the real number sitting in that trust either. Why would they? I never wore it in front of them any more than I wear it in front of anybody else. A man who talks about what he's worth usually hasn't built anything worth talking about. Now let me tell you about my daughter. Kayla Callahan is 29 years old, and she is, without exaggeration, the finest thing Diane and I ever built together. Sharp as her mother, stubborn as me. The kind of woman who talks her way into any room and usually leaves it better than she found it. When she was 8 years old, she negotiated her own curfew extension using a spreadsheet she made herself. I still have that spreadsheet somewhere in a drawer. I was so proud of that girl I could barely stand it. I'm still that proud. What I didn't expect was who she was going to become engaged to, and what that engagement was going to cost me. 2 years ago, Kayla met Preston Vance at a work conference in Charleston. Preston is 34, comes from old Charleston money, the kind of family whose name is on a wing of a hospital and a street downtown. I want to be fair to Preston, so let me say this as generously as I can. He's polite. He's successful, some kind of private wealth management. He has never once been anything but perfectly courteous to my face. But Preston Vance is also the kind of man who has spent his entire life around people who look a very specific way, and somewhere in those 2 years, my daughter started worrying more and more about whether I look that way too. It started small. The way it always starts small. She stopped inviting me to Preston's family events, said it was just easier, said his parents were old-fashioned, said I'd probably be more comfortable at home anyway. I let that slide the first time. Told myself she was being considerate. Second time, I noticed it wasn't consideration at all. Then came the wedding planning. Big affair, 220 guests, a historic venue out on one of the islands, the kind of event that gets written up in a regional magazine afterward. Kayla and I sat down for a tasting at the venue 3 months before the date, the same venue I had quietly paid the full deposit for 6 months earlier, a fact she did not know, because the payment had gone through the trust, through Diane's family name, the same way everything always had. I should have known something was building by how carefully Kayla had been avoiding certain conversations for weeks. We sat in a private tasting room with white orchids on every table. Kayla, myself, and the wedding coordinator, a sharp young woman named Bethany who'd clearly done this 100 times before. Kayla was going over the seating chart on her laptop when she looked up at me, set the laptop down slowly, and I knew whatever was coming had been rehearsed. "Dad," she said, "I love you, but we need to talk about the ceremony photos." "Okay," I said. "It's just," she started, then stopped, then started again the way people do when they've practiced something and it still doesn't come out easy. The photographer does this whole close-up sequence during the vows. Hands, faces, that whole intimate moment. And Preston's family, they're very traditional. Very old Charleston. And she gestured vaguely at my forearms, both sleeves rolled up the way I always wear them. I don't know if the tattoos really match the aesthetic we're going for. The whole vibe is ivory and sage green and very understated. And I just think it might look better in photos if you wore long sleeves. Maybe gloves even for the ceremony itself. The room went quiet. Bethany suddenly found her tablet very interesting. "Gloves," I said. "Just for the ceremony," Kayla said quickly. "You could take them off for the reception." I want to tell you I had some perfect line ready, some gut punch of a comeback that put this whole conversation in its place. I didn't. I sat there for a moment looking at my own daughter, the same girl who used to trace my anchor tattoo with her finger and ask me to tell the story behind every single piece of ink on my arms, story after story, every single bedtime for years. "You used to love these," I said quietly. "I still love you, Dad. I just don't want anything to feel out of place on the one day that's supposed to be perfect." Out of place. 20 years of Navy service, 40 years of a life lived honestly on my own skin, and on the one day she wanted to remember forever, I was the thing that might be out of place. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. Costs you nothing, means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Really?" Relief flooded her face. "You're not upset." "I heard you," I said. That's all I gave her. That's all she needed. We finished the tasting. I ate braised short rib I didn't taste. I signed off on a seating chart I barely looked at. And when the meeting ended, Bethany walked me out to the parking lot and said quietly, almost apologetically, "For what it's worth, Mr. Callahan, I think the tattoos are beautiful. My father has half a sleeve. I think it tells a story." "Thank you, Bethany," I said. "I appreciate that." I meant it more than she probably realized. 20 minutes earlier my own daughter had asked me to hide the very thing a total stranger had just called beautiful, and there was something almost funny about that, in the way things are funny right before they start to genuinely hurt. I drove home along the coast road with the windows down, salt air coming off the marsh, thinking about a 19-year-old kid getting his first tattoo the week before shipping out, and a 58-year-old man 20 minutes ago being told to wear gloves at his own daughter's wedding so his own body wouldn't clash with the flowers. I didn't say anything to Kayla that night, or the next morning, or for 6 weeks after that. Some things you don't fix with a phone call. Some things you let sit until they're ready to be handled properly. Here's what Kayla did not know sitting in that tasting room. Here's what Preston Vance's very traditional, very old Charleston family did not know. Here's what nobody at that venue understood until it was far too late to matter. I had personally paid the full venue deposit 8 months earlier. I had personally covered the dress, a designer gown Kayla had cried actual tears over in a Charleston boutique, paid quietly through the trust the same week she tried it on, before she'd even asked me for help, because that's what fathers do, or at least that's what I always believed fathers did. I had already booked and paid in full for the honeymoon, 10 days in the Amalfi Coast, a surprise I'd been planning to reveal at the rehearsal dinner. None of it had my name on a single invoice. All of it ran through Diane's family trust, quiet, invisible, the same way it always had. Kayla thought Preston's parents were covering the venue. She thought she and Preston were covering the dress and honeymoon themselves out of savings. She had no idea. Absolutely no idea. 6 weeks of silence, and then the wedding coordinator called me directly with a scheduling question about the final vendor payments. The same call she'd been making to me quietly for 8 months without Kayla ever knowing I was the one she was calling. "Mr. Callahan, I just need your sign-off on the final catering invoice and the florist balance, same as always." I sat with that phone in my hand for a long moment. "Bethany," I said, "I need you to hold off on those payments. Don't release anything further until I call you back." There was a pause on her end. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's about to be exactly the way it should be," I said, and I hung up. I didn't call Kayla. I didn't explain myself to anyone. I let the silence do the talking, the same way I've let silence do most of my talking my whole life, because loud men rarely need to be right and quiet men rarely need to prove it. The call came from Kayla 4 days later, panic threading through every word. "Dad, the venue says there's a payment issue. They said the account's been frozen. What's going on? Do you know anything about this?" "I know everything about this," I said. "I've known about it since before you did." Silence on her end. "What does that mean?" "It means I paid your deposit 8 months ago, Kayla. I paid for your dress. I paid for the honeymoon you and Preston think you saved up for yourselves. All of it. Every dollar. Through your mother's family trust, same as it's always been." I could hear her breathing change on the other end of the line. "You've been paying for my wedding this whole time," she said slowly. "And you let me think Preston's parents. I let you think whatever made you comfortable," I said. "The same way I've spent your whole life making sure you never had to worry about where anything came from. And 3 weeks ago you asked me to wear gloves so my own arms wouldn't embarrass you in the photographs." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Dad, I didn't mean it like that." "You meant it exactly like that," I said, calm, steady, the way I've learned to be calm about things that would have leveled me 20 years ago. "You meant every word of it." And I sat there in that tasting room and said nothing, because I've had a whole life of people looking at these arms before they look at me. But I'm done paying quietly for people who are ashamed of the man doing the paying. "So what happens now?" Her voice had gone small. "Now you and Preston figure out what you actually want this wedding to be," I said. "Because I'm not releasing another dollar toward a day where I'm expected to hide who I am to avoid clashing with the flowers." I hung up the phone. I sat on my porch that evening watching the marsh grass move in the tide, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt something close to peace. What happened over the next 10 days, I only pieced together afterward, through Bethany, through my sister Carol, who Kayla had called crying more than once. Preston's parents, it turned out, had never intended to cover a single dollar of that wedding. They'd assumed, the way old money families sometimes do, that whoever was footing the bill was simply beneath the conversation entirely, not worth acknowledging, and so they had never once offered. When the payments froze and Kayla finally admitted to Preston that her own father had been covering everything, quietly, for 8 months, something shifted in that relationship that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what Preston's family revealed about themselves in the scramble that followed. Preston's mother, a woman named Constance Vance, called Kayla directly and suggested, delicately, that perhaps the wedding should be scaled back significantly, perhaps postponed, perhaps reconsidered entirely, given the sudden financial uncertainty. Not one word of concern for Kayla. Not one offer to help cover the gap. Just a very polite, very old Charleston suggestion that maybe this particular match wasn't quite as solid as everyone had assumed once the money stopped flowing quietly in the background. Preston, to his credit, I'll give him this much, pushed back against his own mother. Told her the wedding was happening regardless of who paid for what. But the crack was already there, and cracks like that don't close back up easy once you've seen exactly how deep they go. Kayla showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening, 10 days after that phone call, alone, no makeup, hair pulled back, looking more like the 8-year-old with the curfew spreadsheet than the woman who'd asked me to wear gloves at her wedding. I opened the door and let her in. Not because I owed her anything in that moment, but because whatever she'd come to say, I wanted to hear it sitting down, looking her in the eye. She sat on my couch, the same couch she'd grown up napping on after school, a couch older than most of Preston's family's furniture and twice as comfortable for it. Worn soft in exactly the places a life gets worn soft. I sat across from her in my chair, the one with the ottoman, and I waited. I've waited a lifetime for conversations like this one. I could wait a few more minutes. Dad, she said, and her voice cracked on the word. I've been horrible to you. I know that now. Preston's mother called me last week and all she cared about was how it would look if the wedding fell apart. Not me. Not us. How it would look. She wiped at her eyes. And I realized I'd been doing the exact same thing to you. Worrying about how you'd look instead of who you actually are. I didn't say anything yet. I let her keep going. I remember every single one of those stories, she said, quieter now. The anchor, the ship's wheel, Mom's name on your arm. I used to trace them with my finger and beg you to tell me again, every single one, every night for years. She looked up at me, eyes red. And 3 months ago I asked you to cover them up like they were something shameful. On the one day I should have been proudest to have you standing next to me exactly as you are. Yes, I said. You did. I'm not asking you to release the money, she said. I'm not here for that. I just needed you to know I understand what I did. And I understand if you don't want anything to do with the wedding at all now. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. 29 years old, sitting on the same couch she'd fallen asleep on 1,000 times as a little girl. Finally seeing something she should have seen months ago. I'll release the money, I said. Her head came up fast. Dad, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, I said. I'm doing it because your mother and I built that trust so you'd never have to worry about a single dollar on the day you get married. And I'm not going to let one bad conversation in a tasting room undo 6 years of keeping that promise to her. I paused. But I have conditions. Anything, she said. I walk you down that aisle exactly as I am, I said. Sleeves rolled up. Every piece of ink visible. No gloves. If Preston's family has a problem with what 40 years of an honest life looks like on a man's arms, they can have that problem from the second row. Kayla started crying in earnest then, the real kind, not the composed kind she'd walked in with. Yes, she said. Yes, Dad. Of course. I never should have asked you for anything else. And second, I said, when people ask who paid for this wedding, you tell them the truth. Not because I need the credit. I've never needed the credit for a single thing I've ever built. But because I am done being the quiet part of your story, Kayla. I've been quiet my whole life. I'm not going to be quiet on your wedding day too. She nodded, still crying, and crossed the room to hug me the way she used to when she was small enough to still be lifted off the ground. I held onto that hug a long moment. I'll give you the rest quickly, because you've earned the ending same as I did. The wedding happened 6 weeks later than originally planned, scaled down slightly, moved to a smaller venue closer to the water that I liked considerably better than the first one anyway. Preston's parents attended, cordial, composed, old Charleston to the last, and if Constance Vance had any opinion about the sleeves of ink visible on the father of the bride as he walked his daughter down the aisle, she kept it to herself, because by then, everyone at that wedding knew exactly whose name belonged on the invoices, quiet as it had always been. I walked Kayla down that aisle in short sleeves, every piece of 40 years of my life visible in the afternoon light coming off the water, Diane's name in cursive script on my bicep catching the sun the whole way down. Kayla held my arm the entire walk and never once looked away from it. At the reception, during the father-daughter dance, she leaned in close and said, "Tell me the story of this one again," tracing the ship's wheel on my forearm the way she used to when she was 8 years old, and I told her, every word of it, the same way I always had, and for those 3 minutes on that dance floor, nothing had changed at all between the girl she used to be and the woman she'd finally become again. Carol came to the wedding too, sat in the front row in a dress she bought special for the occasion, and when I walked past her with Kayla on my arm, she caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says more than most speeches ever could. She'd known Diane would have been proud of that walk. She told me so afterward, quietly, by the punch bowl, and I had to step outside for a minute after that, just to breathe the salt air and get myself steady again. My old crew showed up too, all 4 of them, cleaned up in suits that clearly hadn't been worn since somebody's own wedding years back, and every single one of them shook my hand at the reception and told me it was the finest thing they'd seen in years, an old chief walking his girl down the aisle exactly as he'd always been, ink and all. That meant more to me than anything Preston's family could have said, good or bad. I still live in the same house. Still drive the same truck, though Kayla's been threatening to buy me a new one with her own money now, which I've told her I'll accept the day she stops calling it my old truck like it's an insult instead of a compliment. Still get my haircut on Bull Street. Still